Hello everyone, welcome to our Tuesday sew along. We are today doing the block called Vanishing Point. It's number 32, and remember, we're not doing every block in the Blockbuster series. We're doing the fundamental tools that will easily be made into a 12-inch finished block. So that's where we're starting today. So I have a couple of things to share with you to show you. I have made just a single block. And remember on the patterns, there are multiple size options for you. I'm giving you cutting instructions just for 12-inch finished blocks, but you can change the size to any of the sizes listed. And considering that all the tools make multiple sizes, you may even come up with a size that isn't listed on the Blockbuster patterns, and that's perfectly fine. All of the blocks we're doing in this series are 12-inch finished blocks. So what I did was make one block, and I actually made it in a 6-inch size. Now you can actually do the center smaller half square with the same colors that you do the rest of them. What we have here is a half square on the corner, another half square in the opposite corner, and then there's two split Rex units, and they are actually a mirror image, and we'll be talking about that in just a little bit. So I want to share with you, if you decided to do 6-inch, just this 6-inch block or any other size, this is actually the pattern for the Vanishing Point block. So I could take two fabrics and make the red and print version that you see here on the side. I could do this little ombre looking version on the left side, or the one in the middle just has two colors and a background. So I have those three options for how I could put it together. But this is actually the way I colored my block. I put 4 units together, and I've covered them up so you couldn't see it, but this is what I'm actually headed for in my Vanishing Point block. Now, remember the way it is designed, this is the block right there. But I put it together with 4 units, and then I'm actually assembled the smaller 4 patches or half squares in the center. I have assembled a mirror image of a split Rex unit for the side pieces, and then I have my corner unit. So it actually made a big 9 patch. So that's where we're headed for today. Our first step in making this block is we're going to be talking about the half squares, and I've already assembled the 4 smaller ones that go in the center. And again, remember, I could have put my pale blue here and my red here to match. And I'll be sharing with you some other color combinations that you could use a little bit later. Now, this is review for a lot of you. Let me get this down here where you can see it. I've got my plate loaded with the pieces that I need, and I've already stitched my larger squares together for the corner half square units. And I've got my 2 lines drawn, I've stitched, they're ready to cut. I've got the 2 smaller units ready, and I've got my lines already drawn. I did want to point out, when I put this together, I'm putting my 2 squares right sides together. I'm using my half magic wand because on the smaller one, because I can get all the way across that easily with the smaller one. And sometimes the larger one is just more tool than I need. I could have used the full size, the longer one. On this one, you pretty well have to use the longer one because my broken one doesn't fit. So for those of you who haven't been watching me for a long time, I just took my magic wand and broke it in half. So I have 2 short ones. So I have that when I'm doing smaller pieces. So I've got my half squares ready. I've got them face to face, and I'm ready to stitch, and I'm going to stitch on the line. So I'm going to I have my fabric, my needle in a fabric tag to get started, and I'm just going to go across. Assembly line sewing is always more efficient. If I was doing all of the pieces for this block, I would have prepared my smaller squares, sewed them just like I'm doing now. And when I get to the opposite side of my smaller square, I'd grab my larger square, sew across it. Then when I get across my two larger squares, I would just stop and go across the end and turn around and go the other way. I've got my, here we go. I had it set where the needle didn't stop in the down position, and I prefer that, so I switched it. So that every time it stops, my needle stops in the down position. You'll be much happier with that if you have that option on your machine. So I've turned around, I'm going back the other direction, and when I get to the other side, I'm just going to park my needle. And of course, I would have already done that with the larger squares as well. So that's all the stitching I have to do to get prepared for those half squares. So let's go to the overhead camera so you can see what I do next. So I'm going to, first of all, cut these apart, and I've got my Tucker trimmer over here. You want to use something that you can cut corner to corner, and the tool needs to be large enough to protect your fingers. So you don't want to use your magic wand as a cutting guide. Even though it's thick enough, it's not wide enough to protect your fingers. So I'm just using the edge of my Tucker trimmer and going across corner to corner. And this one barely fits on there, but even if it didn't, I could actually start here and just slide it and get all the way across. So that is an option as well. So once you get all of your half squares cut from those pairs of squares, now I'm ready to press. And I'm going to press the larger ones toward the red triangle. And I like to do just a little finger pressing just to get the seams going the way I want them to. And turn my iron back on. It had turned itself off. It's actually warm already, I think. But I put just a little time in on finger pressing, and that makes everything lay down flatter and gets my seams going the right direction before I ever put the heat to it. So once I get them finger pressed, I'm just going to quickly set the iron on them like that. If you're using the acorn pressing pin, then I would grab the acorn pressing pin, give them just a little swipe, and I usually just give them a quick swipe, all of them in a row. It doesn't take a lot of the solution to do the job, and I typically stack them anyway, so they're going to get a little extra time under the iron that way. So there's my first set of half squares, the larger ones. Here's the smaller ones, and I'm going to press these toward the darker fabric. So in this case, I'm using the navy fabric to press against, but you can do whatever color combination you want. I'm going to show you some options a little bit later of things you could do with this block. And I actually saw a pattern. I don't remember if I was looking on Pinterest or Instagram, and there was a pattern made with the Vanishing point block set in a group of 4 like I'm using for our 12-inch block. They had made a whole quilt using those units. And I don't remember now what the quilt was called, but it was actually this block. So when you start looking at blocks differently, you can see all kinds of combinations of units that I show you on our sew-alongs that you could put together all kinds of different arrangements. So now I'm ready to trim this. If you are right-handed, you're going to put the Tucker trimmer, the half circle goes on the right top corner, and I'm lining up the diagonal line on the seam. Now this needs to be trimmed to 2.5 inches. It's going to finish as a 2-inch half square. And I want to make sure that when I place this, I have a sliver that I can trim away on all 4 sides to give me that perfect half square. So I'm going to cut up and across, turn my unit, and now the 2.5 inch line, it's a dashed line, is going on my cut edges. And once I get that in place, I'm going to trim up and across the top again. So I'll trim 4 of those just like that. If you're left-handed, simply turn the seam the opposite way and put the left or the half circle dot on the top left corner. You still want to make sure that you have a space all the way around, and then you're going to cut up the left side and across the top. I'm not going to try that. We're going to go back to this direction. And I've got plenty of room all the way around my 2.5 inch square. All of the half circle, half sizes, things that end in a half, are sized with dashed lines. If you happen to be using a whole number, like a 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch, you're going to be using the whole circle icon, and all of your lines are solid lines instead of dashed lines. So that's another way you can tell if you're on the correct corner of your half square pieces. So for this one, this needs to be trimmed to 4.5. I again use the half circle icon on the top right corner. When I place my tucker trimmer, I want to make sure I have just a sliver to trim all the way around, and my diagonal line goes along that seam, and I want you to see how much I actually trim away. Sometimes you're almost just trimming off the ear that is in the corner. There's not a whole lot of excess, so here's what I actually cut off of that. So not a lot of waste. That's what we want. So there's my 4.5 inch half square unit, and I need all 4 of these for the block. I'll do one more for you. Again, you're lining up this diagonal line on the ruler on the seam, and make sure that you leave yourself room to trim on all 4 sides so you have a nice true square. And that puts those corners down in the seam, down into the corners right where it needs to be. And I just have a tiny sliver, and see, that one just got a tiny little bit of a haircut. So that is how you're going to do your half squares. So let's talk about those split Rex units. Let me get this out of my way. This is what I'm after, and it is a split Rex, actually 2 split Rex units, and they are opposite in the direction that the seam leans. And I can do that with my split Rex tool. I can place them in my block in several different ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to putting the assembling the blocks together. So what we're going to need is our split Rex tool, and we need strips that are 1 inch bigger than the size we want to make. So these need to be 2 inch by 4 inch finished. So that means I need a strip that's 5 inches to be able to make those pieces. So here's my strip. I actually have kind of a half across the width of the fabric strip, and I've got the opposite color. Now, because I've got this mirror image, one seam leans from the top left down to the bottom right, one seam leans the opposite way, I need to make sure when I cut these pieces that I am cutting a mirror image. And the way to do that is to fold your fabric either face to face or back to back. I'll put this one back to back, and I'll put the other one, or this one's face to face. We'll put this one, I should have done it the other way. I think I'll do that so you can see. I'm doing this to show you it doesn't matter whether you have it face to face or back to back, as long as it's one of those. So I've got this one, wrong sides together. My blue one's wrong sides together. My red one is right sides together. It absolutely doesn't matter for this part. My first step is to slice off the selvage. You never want to use the selvage in your project because it just doesn't play nice. It doesn't crease the same. It's a little more tightly woven right here on the edges, and so you can cause yourself a problem in your project if you include that. And by the way, you also don't want to include that in your backing for the same reason. So something to think about. Now on my split Rex tool, I have this angled side, and that's what I'm after. This solid, bold solid line is going to go on that cut edge. When I get it in the right place, my 2x4 finished unit line, and it tells me cut strips 5 inches, that lands right on the base of my strip. When I cut that, I'm going to automatically get a mirror image, which is what I need. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to just slide that up here so you can still see it. Let's come down a little bit so you can see. There we go. So now I'm ready to cut another one. And in order to do that, I'm going to twist my tool. And notice on my tool, I've highlighted one of the lines in red, this long diagonal line, and it tells me that's my second trim guideline, and it's my common diagonal seam line, that line. And then also down here, there's a little tiny mark here that says second trim. And that's another thing I'm looking for when I get ready to cut another pair. So I'm going to cut another pair, and I'm just going to undo them so I can stack them and match the right sides, the lefty and the righty. So again, I'm going to line up here. I'm going to cut again. Every time I cut, I'm getting 2 of them, and they're a mirror image. And I'm going to twist again, and we're going to line up on that second trim line and the long common diagonal. Don't forget, you can mark on your tools. Sometimes that's helpful in placement. It's helpful in finding those lines quickly, especially if you're doing a bunch of them. I actually used my Sharpie and marked right on the back of my tool, but you can put a piece of Scotch tape there. You can put Invisigrip on the back and mark on that if you'd rather do that. So for this block, I need 4 of each. So that's what I got from my strip. Now this is my opposite color. The first thing I'm going to do is cut that off. And I'm just eyeballing it. This is going to get trimmed anyway, so I'm not too worried about it. But again, I'm going to line up on this bold solid line. It says place on cut edge strip. And I'm putting the base line, the 2x4 finished unit, where it says cut strips 5 inches. That's going on the base. When I cut that, I automatically get a mirror image. And notice this one, I was cutting with wrong sides together. It still works. You just want to make sure that you have them stacked so that when you cut, you get 1 of each, 1 righty and 1 lefty. And I'm stacking them that way on my stacks of my red half rectangle. So I'm going to do 1 more twist and line up this long common diagonal and the second trim line. It says that right on that little line. The line here may or may not line up with the edge of your strip. That's okay, but it should be parallel to that line. Once I get 4 sets of those, I'm ready to stitch. So I'm just going to take all of these to the sewing area, and I've got them still stacked. Before I take it over there, I think it might be easier for you to see. When I twist these around, you can see that that seam lines up. If I grab this one, let's put this over here. I'm going to put the other one together, and there's automatically a mirror image, which is what I need. If I turn this whole thing around, it's still a mirror image as far as where the seam is, and that's what I'm looking at right now. Not necessarily the colors, but I'm looking for that mirror image of the seam, and that's what I got just by stacking the way I did. It is possible, let's just do one. It is possible to put, let me put one in the wrong place. it is possible to put those together. It will never work. You can stitch that together. It'll still never trim into a rectangle. So when you're laying your two pieces together, it should basically look like a split rectangle before the seam is there. So do be aware of that. I'm going to line these back up and we're going to go to the sewing area so you can see what that looks like. I see lots of people saying hello. I saw somebody say they liked the new fabric. If you haven't been watching our Facebook page or our Instagram page, I do post, actually I posted on Instagram, and through the magic of the internet, it appears on our Facebook page as well. So I've got this ready to stitch, and I want to make sure that when I lay it there, it already looks like a rectangle. The one that I showed you before, if I tried to sew that together, I'm going to have a problem. So you want to make sure if it looks like that, you've got something wrong, because that doesn't look like a rectangle. Then when I stitch, I basically just center those two angled seams. There's a little bit of an ear sticking out on both ends. See, there's a little tiny bit of red sticking out on this end. If I flip this over, there's a little tiny bit of blue sticking out on that end. And that's the way I like to arrange it so that I make sure that I have room when it's time to trim. And I'm just using a decent 1/4 inch here. I don't have to be real fussy with it because I am going to trim it. That's the thing I like about using these tools. I don't have to fuss with it because I know that they're going to get time to trim a little bit later. So I'm just lining that up, overlapping it enough to where I see a little bit of an ear on both ends. And I'm just stitching from one to the other. When I get that stitched, 2 or 3 stitches, and because my needle's in the down position, it holds my place while I adjust the edges. Makes it a little easier to work with that way. And I've got my plate here where I just do one after the other, assembly line style. I do, it's much more efficient that way. So I'm gonna keep going. So I need one more that's leaning that way. And when I get it in place, then I'm ready to stitch. So that's my 4 units that will lean from the top left to the bottom right corner of my rectangle. Now here's my other split Rex unit, and it's the opposite. It leans from the top right down to the bottom left. And when I get that in place, I'm still looking for that little bit of an ear on both ends. When I start stitching, it absolutely doesn't matter whether I put the red on top or the blue on top because the seam's going to lean the same direction either way. But you do want to check and make sure that you have stacked the right ones together. If it doesn't look like a rectangle already, you've got something wrong. So you want to check that before you try to stitch it together. This one's not a difficult unit to do. You just have to keep yourself a little bit organized. There's some really cool patterns that you can do with this. Tony, can you grab a prism pattern? There are lots of patterns that use a split Rex. I even have one called Split Star. It actually uses the wing clipper tool and the tucker trimmer tool and the split Rex tool. But this one, this is Prism. Prism is only split Rex units, and there's actually a little trick to do the corners of these, the centers, and then the edges on this border. And so you can make that little contemporary quilt just with a split Rex tool. And you've got some righties and some lefties. By that I mean seams that lean from the bottom left up to the top right and some that go the other way. You have some of both, so you're going to do like I did and stack your fabric either right sides together or wrong sides together so that you get that mirror image when you get ready to put your pieces together. So now I'm going to just park my needle, and I've got all my split Rex stitching done. I'm ready to press and trim. And I've got, I'm going to take the time to cut them apart, and then we're ready to go to the ironing surface. So don't forget, I don't think I told you, Tony's here. So if you have questions, put those on there, and she'll um, monitor any questions that need to be answered in real time. All right, so I have all of my units. I don't have to do any other cutting with it until I'm ready to trim. I'm just going to give it a quick little finger press. And notice I happen to pick up two opposite pieces. You can tell because one seam, we'll turn them vertical so you can see, one seam leans left, one seam leans right. And I still take the time to give it a little bit of a finger press so I can set the iron on it. And I'm pressing all of these toward the red or the darker part of my split Rex unit. And I'm not really paying attention to which way they lean when I pick them up because I know I'm going to press all of them toward the darker fabric anyway. And then I tend to just kind of add them to the stack with the seam going the same direction. So these four all go the same direction. Then these four go all the same direction. And then if you're going to use the acorn pressing pin, now would be the time to grab it, and I'll show you. I tend to overlap them like this because that gives them a little of extra time. While that row is heating up, I can quickly grab a couple of them, put some acorn pressing solution on them, grab a couple more, and I do a couple at a time because they're going to get enough of the solution on them just doing that they'll flatten out nicely. And you'll see how nicely they lay down, and you can trim them, and you get great results that way. The nice thing about the way the acorn pressing pin works is that it doesn't have a chance to distort the outside edge of your units. If you're using a spritzer or a spray bottle, you run the risk of distorting the outside edge. So now I've got all of my units pressed. I've got them stacked according to the direction they lean. These are opposites, even though I'm not really looking at the color of the fabric, I'm looking at the direction the seams lean. So I'm going to trim these with my tool in this orientation with this angled part pointing down toward me, and my units are going to be turned sideways like this. If you are left-handed, yours are going to be turned vertical, and you're going to match up these, either the sizing lines or this long common diagonal with the seam. So since I'm going to be cutting right-handed, I'm going to find the 2x4 finished unit line, and that line's going on my seam. I want to make sure that I have a little room all the way around that rectangle so I can trim. And I trim up the short side, across the long side, and then I'm going to turn my unit 180 degrees. Then the 2.5 by 4.5 inch lines, that's my unfinished size of my units. That's what I'm going to trim next. Trim, and notice I have a little flat spot that has to be there in order for the seams to fit in the next seam properly. Now this particular arrangement where I'm leaning from the top left down to the bottom right, that's actually going to line up on this common diagonal, and I'm going to line the seam up on that line. I want to make sure that I have just a little bit to trim away on all four sides. Once I get the first two sides trimmed, I'm going to turn and trim the other two sides, and I'm lining up the 2.5 by 4.5 inch lines on the edges. So there's my trimmed units. Now this is the way that they are shown in the Vanishing Point block when you put four of them together. if I did this, I could stitch that together, but if I was going to make this unit, I would just use the V-block tool and get that without a seam. This is the arrangement I want for that unit. It's going to look like that when I get it stitched. So let's talk about how I arrange that to stitch that properly. And of course, I would go ahead and trim the rest of those units. So let me grab these and we'll go to the sewing area and I'll show you how that is put together. This is where we're headed. I'm going to put these back on here, and you have all sorts of options for how you put together your units. And we'll talk a little bit about other options here in just a second. Let me get to the needle. Oh, Tony reminded me. It's time to clean your machines. It's the first of the month. I actually did mine over the weekend, so clean and oil it according to your manufacturer's instructions because they'll just work better and your machine will last longer. So I am going to put these together, and because of the way I pressed, they're actually going to nest, and I'm going to stitch along this long side, and notice that the seams will nest right along that diagonal seam. Once I get that in place, I'm going to sew off of my fabric tag onto that. You may have to raise your presser foot to get it under there. And it almost doesn't look like you've stitched it properly just because of the angle of that seam. It looks like you've got not enough of a seam allowance. But once you get that in place, it gives you what you need for the next seam that will go across there. Now, at this point, you have to make a decision. You can either press both seams to one side. You can also press open. And in this particular unit, I chose to press open because of what it has to go next to. So I took the time to split that seam open so that I would have less bulk here. Plus, when I put together the smaller pinwheel in the center, that worked better for that. So this is where that unit ends up going. It's going to go right there. So that's how you're going to do the pieces. Now, of course, you don't have to arrange yours the way I did. Remember, that's actually the block, this much of it. So you don't have to put it in a pinwheel like this. You don't have to put these together. But if you choose to, you could make all sorts of arrangements. You could have kind of a wonky pinwheel that way. You could even turn your corners so that they are arranged differently. So you have lots of different ways of arranging the block. You could even turn the darker part in. And so these are just options. Now I did want to show you a couple of settings of, I've got it in my group of alternate projects. I wanted to show you, I've got to find my mouse, different ways you could put it together. So now that you've seen that, here's the three arrangements of colors I showed you at the beginning. You can put together just an arrangement of, this is four sets of the Vanishing Point blocks. So I put in the EQ8, I put 4 Vanishing Point blocks together to create something similar to my piece that I did over there before I rearranged it. And then I put 4 of those together to create a little quilt just with 2 fabrics. And it would be a very attractive little block. You could put that together fairly quickly with just half squares and split Rex units. This one is an arrangement of different colors of combinations. So each of those was just 4 Vanishing Point units put together to make the 12-inch block or whatever size you wanted to make, and then arrange them in just a random color placement. And of course you could always use a similar color placement. So you could also do, depending on what you're making out of that, you could rearrange the colors, you could rearrange the units. You have lots of options. You could also turn those around so that the bigger half squares were in the center and the smaller half squares were on the outside corner. So you have lots of options. So any questions that I need to deal with? I see a lot of hello everyone and happy Tuesday. So luckily our weather's getting better. Pretty soon we'll all be complaining because we're too hot, but for now it is sure nice to have that nice mild weather. So until next week, happy sewing. We'll be doing block number, I better not tell you a number because I'll tell you wrong, just in case it's not the next number. But next week we'll have another sew along on Tuesday. Join us live at 5. And remember, you can see them later on YouTube if you miss it, or you can find it on our Facebook videos. So we'll see you next week. So happy sewing.